Killer Kowalski. The name alone sends shivers down your spine, doesn't it? If you're a wrestling fan, I'm sure you know him as the brutal villain, the man who almost ripped off an opponent's ear, and the guy who terrorized audiences with his bone-crunching claw hold. But what if I told you there was another side to this wrestling legend? A side that might completely change how you see him? Well, today we're going beyond the blood and the bravado to uncover the man behind the monster. And trust me, it's a story full of surprises. Now let's go back to the beginning. Kowalski started wrestling in the 1940s, a time when the sport was rough and tumble, a lot less showmanship and a lot more, well, real pain. He quickly made a name for himself as a fearsome competitor, someone who wasn't afraid to push the limits. And that's where the killer personality was born. He perfected this image of a merciless villain, and his signature move, the claw hold, was enough to make anyone cringe. He'd lock it in, and you could almost hear the crowd gasp, wondering if his opponent would ever escape. He wasn't just a wrestler, he was a master of intimidation. But Kowalski's reputation wasn't confined to the ring. He had a few run-ins outside of wrestling that only added to his killer image. Let's start with one of the most talked about incidents in wrestling history. Back in 1952, Kowalski was in a match with a wrestler named Yukon Eric. Now, Eric was a big, tough guy with years of experience, but he also had the scars to prove it. His ear was already pretty damaged from years of wrestling, a condition many wrestlers get called cauliflower ear. During the match, Kowalski delivered a move that accidentally tore off part of Eric's already damaged ear. The truth is, it was an accident. But in the world of wrestling, perception is everything. This moment was perfect for building Kowalski's image as a brutal villain, and it stuck. Fans believed he was the most dangerous man in the ring, and that reputation followed him for the rest of his career. The name Killer Kowalski had officially been solidified, and people loved to hate him. A few years later, in 1958, Kowalski found himself in the middle of another dramatic moment, this time with a legend outside the wrestling world. Jack Dempsey, the famous boxing champion, was serving as a guest referee for a match between Kowalski and Pat O'Connor. During the match, things got a little too intense, and Kowalski accidentally kicked Dempsey in the diaphragm. Dempsey ended up in the hospital because of it. You'd think this would cause some major fallout, but Dempsey, being the tough guy he was, didn't blame Kowalski. Still, the incident only added to Kowalski's reputation as a dangerous and unpredictable force in the ring. Then, there was that infamous incident on an Australian talk show where he put the host in a headlock. Live on air. And let's not forget the stories about his training methods. Some say he was incredibly tough on his students, maybe even too tough. In the 1990s, Kowalski took on a new challenge, running his own wrestling school. It was a place where he passed on everything he'd learned in the ring to a new generation of wrestlers. And you know what? Some of his students went on to do really big things in the wrestling world, but not everything about his school was sunshine and rainbows. A few trainees claimed he was too rough, even saying his training methods left them injured. This caused a bit of bad press, but for many others, his tough love style was exactly what they needed to survive and thrive in the grueling world of professional wrestling. Even though Kowalski had built this larger-than-life image in the ring, he wasn't invincible. Years of high-impact matches and non-stop wrestling took their toll on his body, just like they do for most wrestlers. He dealt with countless injuries and the wear and tear that comes with such a physically demanding career. By the time he hung up his boots, his body had been through a lot, but his love for the sport, that never wavered for a second. And here's where Kowalski's story takes a surprising turn. Later in life, the man who had once terrified fans with his ruthless persona started to show a completely different side of himself. He became a vocal advocate for animal rights. Yes, the guy known as Killer was out there standing up for compassion and kindness. It was a side of him that few people had ever seen, and it just goes to show you that people are never as one-dimensional as they might seem. Even the most intimidating figures can evolve and use their platform for something positive. But time catches up with everyone, even someone as larger than life as Killer Kowalski. In 2008, he suffered a massive heart attack and was rushed to the hospital. For 12 long days, his family and friends stayed by his side, holding on to hope. Sadly, on August 30th, 2008, he passed away peacefully at the age of 81. It really felt like the end of an era, and the wrestling world came together to mourn the loss of a true legend. What makes Kowalski's story so fascinating isn't just the moments that grabbed headlines, it's the legacy he left behind. He wasn't just the villain everyone loved to hate in the ring. He was a trailblazer, a mentor, and a role model for so many up-and-coming wrestlers. He didn't just teach them how to wrestle, he taught them what it takes to survive in one of the toughest industries out there. And let's not forget that incredible transformation he went through later in life. I mean, how often do you see someone who built their entire career on being feared to turn around and become a symbol of compassion? That's what made Killer Kowalski so special. He wasn't just a wrestler, he was a complex, multi-layered person who left a lasting impression on everyone who crossed his path. As a fan, I'm convinced he was one of the greatest wrestlers ever, but if you're still not convinced, let me take you on a career rundown. I'm sure you'll enjoy each bit of it. Killer Kowalski's real name was Edward Władysław Spolnik, and he was born on October 13, 1926 in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. His parents were Polish immigrants who worked hard to make a life for themselves and their family. Edward grew up in a modest home, and like most kids, he was encouraged to follow a safe, respectable career path. He was a bright student, and by the time he was old enough to think about his future, he chose to study electrical engineering at the University of Detroit. Can you imagine? If life had gone a little differently, Kowalski might have spent his days in an office instead of a wrestling ring. But there was something about Edward that just didn't fit into the mold of a typical engineer. He was huge, 6'7", tall, and over 250 pounds of pure muscle. He stood out everywhere he went, and his natural strength and athleticism turned heads. Eventually, he started training for professional wrestling, and by 1947, he made his debut under the name Władek Kowalski. In those early days, Kowalski was just another wrestler trying to make a name for himself. He wasn't the villain we know today, but he was good, really good. His size and intensity made him stand out, and it didn't take long for promoters and fans to realize that this guy was something special. The moment that changed everything came in 1952, during a match against Yukon Eric. Now, Yukon Eric was a fan favorite, a big, burly guy who had been wrestling for years. During their match, Kowalski delivered a knee drop, and part of Eric's ear was torn off. The truth is, Eric's ear had already been damaged from years of wrestling, but in the heat of the moment, fans didn't care about the details. All they saw was blood and chaos. The newspapers ran with it, dubbing Kowalski a brutal monster. Fans were horrified but fascinated. And you know what? Kowalski leaned into it. He embraced the nickname Killer and transformed himself into the ultimate wrestling villain. He wore all black gear, perfected his menacing glare, and created his infamous claw hold, a move that would become his signature. From that moment on, Killer Kowalski was a star. Kowalski's career took off in the 1950s and didn't slow down for decades. He traveled the world, wrestling in the biggest promotions and taking on some of the most iconic names in the business. His matches were brutal, physical, and unforgettable. Fans loved to hate him, and Kowalski played the role to perfection. But it wasn't all about the persona. Behind the scenes, Kowalski was known as a true professional. He was reliable, he worked hard, and he took the business seriously. That's why he stayed on top for so long, because he had the skill to back up the showmanship. Over the years, Kowalski had plenty of memorable moments, both in and out of the ring. In 1958, during a match refereed by boxing legend Jack Dempsey, Kowalski accidentally kicked Dempsey in the diaphragm. The poor guy had to be hospitalized, but to his credit, Dempsey didn't hold it against him. Instead, the incident just added to Kowalski's reputation as a dangerous man in the ring. And who could forget the 1967 Don Lane incident? Kowalski appeared on Lane's Australian talk show, and things got tense. In a moment that left audiences gasping, Kowalski put his claw hold on the host, right there on live TV. Was it real? Was it staged? No one knew for sure, and that was the genius of Kowalski. He always kept people guessing. By the late 1970s, Kowalski's body had taken a beating. Wrestling is tough on anyone, and Kowalski wasn't immune to the wear and tear of decades in the ring. In 1977, he decided to hang up his boots and retire from active competition. But Kowalski wasn't done with wrestling. Not by a long shot. Instead of stepping away, he opened a wrestling school in the 1990s, passing on his knowledge to the next generation of wrestlers. Some of his students went on to become huge stars like Triple H, Chyna, and Perry Saturn. Now, training with Kowalski wasn't for the faint of heart. He was tough, and some trainees complained that his methods were a little too rough. There were even accusations of injuries during training. But for many, his no-nonsense approach was exactly what they needed to succeed in the grueling world of professional wrestling. As intimidating as Killer Kowalski was in the ring, his later years revealed a completely different side of him. He became an advocate for animal rights, championing compassion and kindness, a far cry from the ruthless villain fans remembered. It was such a stark contrast that it shocked people at first, but it also showed just how much depth Kowalski had. He wasn't just the character he played in the ring, he was a man who cared deeply about making a positive impact. In 2008, Killer Kowalski suffered a massive heart attack and was hospitalized. For 12 long days, his loved ones stayed by his side, hoping he would pull through. Sadly, on August 30th, 2008, he passed away at the age of 81. The wrestling world mourned the loss of a true legend. Fans, colleagues, and former students all came together to honor the man who had given so much to the sport. Killer Kowalski's legacy is one of the most fascinating and enduring in professional wrestling history. He wasn't just a star in the ring, he was a pioneer, a teacher, and a role model for countless wrestlers who came after him. His influence goes far beyond the ear-tearing incident or his infamous claw hold. As a wrestler, Kowalski set the standard for how to portray a larger-than-life villain. He understood that wrestling wasn't just about athletic ability. It was about storytelling, drama, and connecting with the audience. His ability to make fans love to hate him elevated wrestling as a spectacle and laid the groundwork for the theatrical elements we see in wrestling today. Wrestlers like The Undertaker, Kane, and countless others who embrace dark, intimidating personas owe a part of their success to the path Kowalski carved out. But Kowalski's contributions didn't stop when he retired from active competition. Through his wrestling school, he shaped the careers of some of the biggest stars in the industry. Triple H, one of the most influential figures in modern wrestling, credits Kowalski for teaching him the discipline and craft required to succeed. Chyna, a trailblazer for women in wrestling, also trained under him, as did Perry Saturn and many others. These wrestlers didn't just learn moves from Kowalski, they learned what it meant to dedicate themselves to their craft. Beyond the world of wrestling, Kowalski's transformation into an advocate for animal rights showed his softer, more compassionate side. It was a stark contrast to his in-ring persona, and it made people realize that even the fiercest characters can have a deep well of kindness. His advocacy work left an impression on those who knew him, proving that his legacy extended well beyond the squared circle. Killer Kowalski's story is about more than just wrestling. It's about evolution, passion, and finding ways to make a positive impact, no matter where you start. He showed that it's never too late to grow and use your platform to help others. So, what do you think about Killer Kowalski's incredible life and career? From his fearsome days in the ring to his surprising transformation into a mentor and advocate, his story is one of the most inspiring in wrestling history. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the life of a legend, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any future stories about wrestling's biggest icons. Thanks for watching, and let us know in the comments, what's your favorite Killer Kowalski moment? Until next time, take care, and we'll see you in the next video.